Westover, Shirley, Stratford Hall, to see the grand plantations of the Tidewater and the relics of the era that made them is to see a landscape that feels like a deliberate, finished work of art. You see the symmetry of the Georgian mansions, the vast, rolling fields, and the quiet, almost liturgical presence of the old parish churches or shaded arcades of the old county courthouses. It is easy to look at this and imagine a world of effortless grace, a cavalier society that simply stepped off a posh ship from London and began reciting Virgil in the wilderness as carriages rolled through magnificent passages already lined by ancient oaks and blossoming flowers. But as we investigate the Old Dominion's incredible history, we find that this grace was not the starting point. It was a hard-won achievement, built on the back of a singular, demanding botanical master, tobacco. Before there were the topping people whose incredible stories of leadership and civilization building so dominated the history of Virginia, there was a starving rabble that lost 5 out of every 6 of its members. Before there were the elegant first families and their cherished country homes, there was a brutal necessity that dictated every move the English made in the New World. Today, we are stripping away the moonlight magnolias of what became the immortal home of chivalry in America. We're looking at the foundational period of the Old Dominion, roughly 1607 to 1700. We are going to explore how a failed communal experiment was rescued by a single stinking weed, as they called it. How that weed dictated the layout of what replaced the primordial American forest, and how the topping people produced a legal and social scaffold to support gentility in America. This is the story of how Virginia became the land of tobacco, plantations, and the colonial aristocracy that built America. Welcome back to The Old World with Will Tanner. This is the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventures and magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video around if you like it. That's how we grow and keep this project going. Last time, we ended the series on Lewis and Clark, with the tale of their legacy and how it was unduly blunted by a series of misfortunes and mistakes that cost them much of the scientific prominence they really deserved. This time, we're starting a whole new series, and starting the Virginia series. Where else could we begin but with those 2 things that defined Virginia for its entire period of greatness, the plantation and the tobacco grown upon it? Much of what is mentioned here is introductory, explaining key aspects of life in Virginia that will be built upon in more depth in future videos. While most of our videos have so far been narratives rather than more general histories, this is the latter, as a few of these introductory ones will be, I think, necessary to describe the background of what's going on in our future narrative videos and why things happened as they did. I think understanding the context of the Old Dominion and what was built within it is really important. So if there's something you'd like me to cover specifically in a future video, an aspect of Virginia that you think is important that I might want to cover, please just leave a comment letting me know. I have a whole series of these planned out that I'm super excited for, but would really love to hear what y'all think and would like to hear about as I do these introductory ones. So let's get into the story. To understand the rise of the Virginia gentry, we must first understand the absolute failure of what they replaced. The system that the Virginia Company tried to build before them. This was the horrible period characterized by the starving time of 1609 to 1610, a period of horrid one in which men died in the streets and in which one man was accused of salting and eating his wife, but which really lasted intermittently for much of the decade. In fact, while that particular period is often treated as a tragic accident of weather or poor planning, the reality is a deeper, more systemic rot. When the Virginia Company of London sent to what became Virginia the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery under the command of Captain Christopher Newport in 1607, it didn't intend to recreate English landed society in the New World. No, those stuffed ships alighted on the muddy and mosquito-clouded shores of the Chesapeake for other purposes, purposes rooted in imperial posturing and mercantilist ideas of trade and resource supply lines. Sure, they sent some aristocrats, mainly feckless second sons, a bit more on that in a bit, along with many servants of the company, but they were all there to run a corporate outpost, make a profit for themselves and shareholders through resource extraction on the company's behalf, while building a colony that would bring the bright light of Protestantism to the New World and compete with the Spanish Catholic dominion of both newly discovered continents. They were there to find gold, to harvest valuable timber, to replace British lines of naval supply that stretched into the bitter cold of Muscovy and Scandinavia, not to build their own farms growing some smoke-producing, intoxicating weed. And so, for the first decade, roughly from 1607 into the 1610s, Virginia was operated under a common store system. This was a communalist model in which every man labored for the company and every man drew his rations from a central warehouse. What few farm products there were, what supplies arrived, what was gifted by the Indians, all went into the common pot, and the men drew from it. The result was a catastrophe. In an environment where the individual did not own the fruits of his labor, there was no incentive for industry, and this created the natural attendant of communalism, a culture of sloth that left the colony starving. Why break your back clearing a primordial forest in 100-degree heat and near total humidity when your bowl of corn is guaranteed regardless of your output? Or conversely, and much more likely, why work at all when you know the man next to you is doing nothing, as he is a son of an aristocrat and so refuses to work, or otherwise a rotter? You'll starve either way, there's no corn, so you might as well just not labor in the fields first. This communalism almost killed the entire Virginia project. It was a system that incentivized the very refusal to work that so notoriously plagued the early years of Jamestown. It didn't help that what laborers there were mainly the riffraff of London, not competent farmers. And it wasn't just the laborers. The Virginia Company did send high-born sons over in those first waves. Men like George Percy, the brother of the Earl of Northumberland, one of the few aristocrats to set up in America. These were men of the highest lineage, the very definition of the English landed elite. But in the mud of Jamestown, that lineage was largely a death sentence. These aristocrats, some of whom were so delusional about what they would find in the New World that they arrived with immense quantities of starch for their collars and shirts, the ruffles of them, generally died quickly. They were unaccustomed to the harsh, malarial conditions of the swamp, as all were. More importantly, they were culturally allergic to manual labor. They viewed the clearing of land and the planting of crops as beneath their station, and so they sat in the heat, bowling in the street and waiting for a civilization to build itself around them, or at least for more food to arrive, while the communal store dwindled to nothing. They were brave in fighting Indians, exploring the wilderness, as the heroic John Smith became famous for. They weren't originally called gentlemen adventurers for nothing. But all that mattered very little when the starving times came, and the communal pot was empty, as it nearly always was. It was only when the company realized that Virginia would only survive if it transitioned to private property that the starving periods ended, as such as when the communal model ended. The Great Charter of 1618 did away with the communal disaster. It offered the settlers the gains of industry, the promise that what you grew or produced belonged to you. But the question remained, what would they produce? They tried silk, the worms died. They tried glassmaking, the heat was too much, the market too far. They tried iron, the wilderness swallowed the forges. They were looking for gold, but they found none, just some pyrite that deceived them and made them look very foolish when it arrived in England. There was timber to be harvested, but they quickly came to ignore it. Instead, what they found was a green, leafy plant that would become more valuable than any mine and fund the creation of America's largest and wealthiest colony. That would be tobacco, of course. In 1612, a man named John Rolfe, better known to the popular imagination for his fairy tale like marriage to Pocahontas, the daughter of local bigwig Chief Powhatan, but far more significant for his illicit seeds, changed the history of the world. The native Virginia tobacco, Nicotiana rustica, was harsh and biting. Grown and occasionally used by the Indians, it was so unpleasant as to be unsmokable by European standards. Rolfe, sensing an opportunity, smuggled seeds of Nicotiana tabacum from the Spanish West Indies. This was Orinoco tobacco, sweet, mild, and highly addictive to the London market. It was to be addictive to the fortune seekers in Virginia as well, and they poured immense resources into growing it. By 1617, the shift was total. Tobacco dominated Virginia. It was being grown in the very streets of Jamestown. It was planted in the marketplaces and the churchyards, and even between the graves. All Virginians spent so much time on its cultivation that the company feared the starving times would resume, not for lack of work, but for lack of time taken to grow grain instead of tobacco. Such almost happened a few times. We must pause here to understand the value discrepancy that dictated the Virginian mind. In the early 17th century, a laborer could produce significantly more wealth in a single season growing tobacco in Virginia than he could by farming corn or wheat. In fact, tobacco was worth about 6 to 10 times, depending on who you asked, the value of grain per unit of labor. This meant, in turn, that tobacco effectively killed all other industries in the colony, from timber harvesting and iron smelting to grain growing or gold seeking. Why find timber suitable for the Royal Navy or grow hemp for its ropes? Why mine iron? Why plant flax for linen or mulberry trees to feed silkworms? Why even grow enough food to eat? The English in Virginia became monomaniacs. They were gamblers on a global scale, betting their lives and their labor on a single crop. No wonder they had such fondness for cards and dice later on. The search for gold was over. They'd found it in a leaf. And so the whole colony became built on smoke, as King Charles acidly observed. With the 1618 charter, the common store was replaced by private enterprise. With it came the Headright system. Out of this moment, the gentry eventually flowered. The conditions created by it, ones that allowed land accumulation on a vast scale, were to create a class of aristocratic planters and landed gentlemen unlike any seen in America before or since. The rule was simple. If you brought a head to Virginia, be it yourself, your wife, or an indentured servant for whose passage you paid, the crown granted you 50 acres of land. There's no limit other than how many people you could import or claim to have imported. And the more indentured servants you brought over, the more land you could clear and cultivate tobacco on. Land thus became the primary capital of the colony, the form of wealth in which every man who was anybody wanted to be and was measured. Whether a servant starting out in life with a few dozen measly acres, a hardworking yeoman with a few hundred, or a grandee with tens of thousands, land was the main yardstick by which a man was measured. It was a way of measuring not just wealth, but power, staying power, and prominence. But there was a problem. There was no money, no gold coins, no silver shillings, or very little, at least. So the colony turned the crop into the currency. Tobacco became the official legal tender of the Old Dominion. Taxes were not paid in coins, they were paid in pounds of tobacco. When a man was fined for missing church, the fine was 50 pounds of tobacco. When he was settling up with his neighbors, buying a drink at a tavern, or donating to the needy, he was doing so in pounds of tobacco. More importantly, the salaries of the Anglican clergy, the very moral and social glue of what was to become the Cavalier colony, were paid in tobacco. This was later to give Patrick Henry a path to prominence. But that's a tale for later. Eventually, this evolved into the tobacco note system. A planter would take his hogsheads, large barrels of tobacco, to a public warehouse. A government inspector, typically a member of the gentry, would check the quality and issue a receipt. These receipts, or notes, functioned as paper money. You could pay a debt, buy a horse, or settle a legal suit by simply handing over a tobacco note. The entire legal and social structure of Virginia was indexed to the value of a leaf that exhausted the soil in which it grew and was increasingly grown in prodigious and ever-expanding amounts. pressing its value immensely at the same time as an entire colony came to rely exclusively upon it. But that was all what was to come. In the early days, Virginia was not a park, but a howling wilderness, as shown by the immense, crushing physicality of the work it took to just get tobacco in the ground. Virginia, as was most of America, was a primordial forest, a dense, ancient canopy of hardwoods so thick that sunlight rarely hit the ground. To a modern person, an acre is a unit of measurement. To Virginians of a later date, it was a yardstick by which a man's wealth, and frequently his capacity as a man and a leader, was measured. But to an early 17th century Virginian, or a settler of many a later date, an acre was a battlefield. It was full of twisted and ancient forests of trees with which one had to do back-breaking battle just to survive. It took one man nearly a full month of grueling labor just to clear 1 acre of this ancient timber that covered the land. Remember, they didn't have bulldozers. For a while, they didn't really have good saws. They had axes and they had fire. They would girdle the trees, cutting a ring around the bark that would eventually wither and kill the tree, and then plant their tobacco between the standing skeletal remains of the forest. This physical reality created a specific labor math that defined and created the plantation system. First was the individual capacity. A single laborer, whether free, indentured, or later enslaved, could only realistically cultivate about 2 to 3 acres of tobacco per season. Any more, and the weeds or the worms would destroy the crop. He just wouldn't have enough time to tend it properly because each individual tobacco plant had to be so carefully cared for. Depending on the fertility of the soil and luck, a good planter could get anywhere from 500 to 1,000 pounds of tobacco leaf out of each acre under intensive cultivation. This meant the average solitary yeoman was producing, on seasoned rather than virgin land, about 1,800 or so pounds of quality tobacco a year at the maximum, the produce of 3 acres of land. Remember, it takes about a month to clear each acre of land of trees. By the 1660s and 1670s, this was standardized, and the standard hogshead, the large barrel used for shipping, had about 600 pounds of tobacco leaf that you could pack into it. Therefore, a highly efficient acre of Virginia soil generally produced 1 to, at most, 1.5 hogsheads of marketable tobacco per year. Second was the issue of soil exhaustion. Tobacco is a heavy feeder. It sucks the nitrogen and potash out of the soil with a rapacity that few other crops match. After 3 to 5 years, depending on luck and how intensively the tobacco is cultivated, even an originally prime tobacco field was effectively dead. Worse, manuring tobacco fields to replenish the depleted soil with fertilizers was impractical. It was too expensive, for one, as livestock in Virginia were scarce for much of the first century. Remember, any animals, farm animals in Virginia, had to first be brought over on a lengthy ship voyage from England, then raised and bred in a challenging and different frontier environment, and in any case, they were generally allowed to roam the woods rather than being kept penned up where their manure could easily be used. Yet worse, manure made the tobacco taste terrible, so no one would want to buy tobacco from a manured field. Thus, once the soil was exhausted, quality tobacco just couldn't be grown on it. Corn or grain potentially could be, but not tobacco, the lifeblood of anyone who wanted to make money at this point in Virginia's history. This meant that if you wanted to stay wealthy, or even an independent farmer at all, you couldn't just own one small farm. You had to own a vast estate. You needed 1,000 acres and plenty of indentured servants, or slaves later on, just so you could cultivate 50 acres at a time, allowing the rest to stay fallow or in timber for the next generation. You needed to always be on the lookout for good deals on fresh land, as that is what would ensure the staying power of you and your dynasty. Otherwise, it would be left trying to farm fallow soil, suffer immensely. This wasteful land usage was a botanical necessity. It is why the Virginia gentry lived in isolated manors rather than in European-style villages, more on that in a bit, and why their history is characterized by such a greed for ever larger acreages. They had to be miles apart and always growing their estates just to ensure their survival. To move from being a middle-class planter to a grande, to reach that topping people status, You needed a workforce of at least 20 people, or more, preferably. Only at that scale could you start delegating the labor, survive the soil exhaustion, and attain the leisure required to serve as a magistrate or a vestryman, all while working constantly to find new land and have some members of your workforce engaged in clearing it. Now we reach the most significant transition in our story, the shift from the indentured servant to the slaves. In the early 1600s, the Headright was fueled by English indentured servants, generally poor young men and women who traded generally 5 to 7 years of their lives for passage. But for budding Grande, the indenture model was structurally flawed. First, there was the seasoning aspect. In the Tidewater, the mortality rate for new arrivals was horrific. Malaria and dysentery, along with the generally sultry weather, killed nearly half of the newcomers within their first year. A planter who paid for a servant's passage was taking a massive financial gamble. If the servant died in the first 6 months, the investment was a total loss. The indentured servants were generally treated quite well, but nevertheless died at a high rate. Particularly, they had the misfortune of arriving in summer and missed the opportunity to acclimate to the hot, humid, and pestiferious environment of the Chesapeake. They were probably going to die. Second, there was a turnover problem. The short turnover period of indentured servants was a constant problem and expense. Planters faced a high seasoning mortality rate and then lost the trained labor just as it became experienced and productive. And once they were free, they became your competitors. Making this even more expensive is that the planter was legally shackled by the mandate of freedom dues, the statutory requirement that a master provide a departing servant with grain, clothing, and the technical rights to land. This ensured that the elite were not only losing their most experienced labor at the peak of their productivity years, but were effectively compelled to subsidize the creation of their own direct competitors. This made the permanent hereditary investment of slavery an increasingly logical investment, morality aside, for those planters who had the capital for it. Third was the very related mechanic problem from which the colony long suffered. Because tobacco was so profitable, every free carpenter, blacksmith, or mason who arrived in Virginia immediately abandoned his trade to grow tobacco. Why work for a daily wage when you could be master of your own tobacco patch? None did. This made it nearly impossible for planters to hire free artisans, and constantly importing new ones as indentured servants was risky and expensive. So to solve this, the Gentry eventually began to import a great many slaves, first of whom arrived in 1619 on a ship long described as a Dutch man-of-war, but was really a British privateer ship employed by the deputy governor, Samuel Argall, a man as brave in frontier warfare as he was greedy to make a profit in the New World. Eventually, these slaves were not just sent into the fields, but trained in the mechanical arts. And so the shift from indentured servants to slavery was not just a pursuit of labor, it was a pursuit of workforce stability, as it offered what indenture could not, namely, 1, permanence, a laborer who didn't leave after a few short and expensive years; 2nd, hereditary status, a workforce that grew with the estate; and 3rd, total mastery, the ability to create a skilled artisan class, blacksmiths, weavers, masons, that was legally tied to the plantation. By the late 17th century, slavery began to grow in popularity in the 1630s and had won out as a labor system by the 1680s. The logic of the tobacco estate had won out. The laws were progressively tightened to codify racialized slavery as the permanent labor solution to Virginia's labor needs. The cavalier lifestyle of leisure, political leadership, was now physically possible because the labor was both permanent and skilled. But while the gentry flourished out of these conditions, there were challenges along the way for them and the yeomanry alike. Chief among these were the Navigation Acts, which were mercantilism at its worst. Under King Charles II, the English crown decided to try to funnel the vast wealth of the Chesapeake, which was still substantial in this period, into its pocket, and so banned the Dutch and other foreigners from the carrying trade of tobacco. They forced all Virginia tobacco to go through English ports, which meant it ended up in English warehouses before heading to the continent, if it headed to the continent at all, which didn't happen in times of war, which were frequent. This created a very problematic monopsony, a market where there's only one buyer. Tobacco prices plummeted as a result. Paired with the immense growth in the quantity of tobacco cultivated, the results were severe, exacerbating the shift from small yeomen to plantations. Low prices drove the little guy under and encouraged further engrossment of the land into large, slave-worked operations that could take advantage of economies of scale to still make a profit in depressed markets. In the early 1620s, tobacco was less a crop than a gold mine, fetching as much as 3 shillings per pound in their currency, roughly $38 per pound in today's purchasing power. So a single 600-pound hogshead could bring in 90 pounds sterling, or over $22,000 today. It was a period of dizzying profit that fueled the dream of the smallholder and built great fortunes for what large growers there were. But by the 1680s, that world had vanished. The price collapsed to a brutal floor of 1 or 2 pence at most per pound, sometimes even less, a mere $1.50 to $3 in modern terms per pound of tobacco. For the middle-class yeoman, this was an existential winnowing that left many unable to even afford clothes with which they could clothe themselves or their families. At a penny a pound, the margin for error was zero. A single dry season, the loss of a seasoned servant, if the yeoman was lucky enough to have any indentured servants at all, meant total insolvency. These small men were systematically squeezed out, their riverfront patents gobbled up by wealthier neighbors, effectively ending any version of a Virginia built on a system of yeoman farms. It was dominated by great men and their great estates. For the Grandes, this collapse was the catalyst for the large plantation system. To survive a market where the revenue per hogshead had fallen from that $22,000 peak down to a precarious $900, one had to replace intensive cultivation with a massive industrial scale volume. This economic reality made the transition to a permanent enslaved labor class a calculated necessity. The Grande required a labor pool that was both permanent and hereditary to hedge against the volatility of the leaf and the high turnover costs of English indentures. By engrossing thousands and thousands of acres to combat soil exhaustion and centralizing all mechanical arts within the manor walls, the topping people ensured their survival, growing tens of thousands or even 100,000 pounds of tobacco a season sometimes. But they did so by transforming Virginia from a society of settlers into a society of masters. Altogether, this led to the ascendance of the plantation system, which defeated out both the small farms of the yeomen, as just covered, and the hundreds, originally envisioned as being what would populate Virginia. The 100 had been the initial architectural map for the English project in Virginia, a traditionalist attempt to replicate the Old World village model. It was designed as a clustered, semi-communal unit of settlement where life revolved around a defensive cluster and a shared church, prioritizing mutual security and a diverse, subsistence-based economy. Settlements like Bermuda 100 or Flowerdew 100 were meant to be the social building blocks of a stable, compact society of smallholders. In this English blueprint, land was meant to be held in small, manageable portions, supporting a community of neighbors who lived within earshot of one another. It was a vision of social cohesion that relied on cereal crop farming, raising animals, and a variety of early manufactures, a world where the village green, not the isolated manor, was the center of social gravity. However, the singular importance of tobacco and the need to grow it at an immense scale acted as a structural solvent, melting the 100 system into the sprawling, isolated world of the plantation. Because the sweet-scented leaf was such a rapacious feeder, exhausting the nitrogen of the soil within a few years, it rendered the compact village model economically suicidal. Tobacco demanded room to breathe and a constant westward push into the primordial forest to secure virgin land. Further, it had to be grown at massive scale by an enslaved or indentured workforce to be profitable, particularly as the price declined, meaning great estates ruled by one great proprietor would win out over villages in the howling wilds. As such, we will conclude with what the plantation system developed into by the mid-1700s, at which point it had truly flowered. These are the Virginia plantations you'd think of. When developed, the Virginia plantation had become the most sophisticated social machine in North America. We can visualize the Golden Age estate as a statement of the Palladian symmetry that guided the construction of many of its beautiful Georgian houses. Houses which were built largely starting in the early 18th century to prove that the English cavalier had successfully tamed the wilderness and replaced it with classical order. But the big house, the centerpiece of any plantation of note, was just the center of a grand and self-reliant estate that could produce its own goods, its own food, and finish its own tobacco while doing much else besides. These were coherent and self-contained economic units. So, surrounding the big house was a village of dependencies. Things like the detached kitchen, which kept the heat and risk of fire away from the great house, smoke houses and weaving houses, places where the plantation self-sufficiency was managed, the quarters, where the slave workforce lived, community that, by the mid-18th century, was often larger than many colonial towns, and then other facilities, typically manufactories like nail-producing centers, a dairy-like buildings, and, of course, drying houses for the tobacco, and likely also a wharf or a dock where tobacco could be loaded directly onto merchant vessels, giving the owners of these big plantations, which existed largely along the rivers of the Chesapeake, a significant price advantage over the scattered estates of the yeomen. The big English merchant ships could just sail up and load hogsheads of tobacco from these big plantations. In a state like Nominee Hall, the seat of the Carter family, covered tens of thousands of acres. It featured grist mills, iron forges, and even its own fleet of small boats to move tobacco to the ships. It was a microstate governed by a lord of the manor who, like an Old Testament patriarch, acted as judge, jury, and provider, and built along the rivers so the house could be more beautifully situated for guests and more efficiently positioned for the loading of the great tobacco ships. This was the pinnacle of the topping people's achievement. They had created a society that mirrored the British gentry in every way, except that its foundation was built on a debt-driven, slave labor, monocrop economy that was rapidly depleting the soil on which it was built. So we returned to where we began. The Virginia gentry was not a fluke of history. It was a structural response to a specific set of challenges. They tried communalism. It failed. They tried manufactures. They failed. They turned to tobacco because it was the only way to make the labor of a month worth more than a bowl of corn. They turned to the Headright system because they needed land to offset soil exhaustion. They turned to slavery because they needed a permanent, skilled workforce in a land where free men preferred the frontier. And they turned to the consignment system because they craved the intellectual, material connection to their home in England. More on that system in a bit. A few other episodes. By 1700, the basis of life in Virginia through the war between the states was set. The 21 families became the greats among the first families of Virginia. Families with names like Lee, Harrison, Custis, Randolph, and Carter were intermarrying, consolidating their extensive land holdings and serving on the county courts. The plantation model was set. The British merchants, Virginia factors, and slave workforces had been set up and were humming along. The planters were masters of their world and ready to continue in that role. Next time on the Story of the Old Dominion, we explore the cultural traditions from whence those masters came, that of Cavalier culture, the Cavalier-Puritan divide, and the truth of the Virginia Cavaliers. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.